So with us today, we have Dr. Marisol Berti. She is from NDSU, and she's a professor of plant science. Her interests are in the area of forage. I am Sarah Bowder. I'm the South Dakota forage field specialist for SDSU Extension. So because I work with forages, I work with Marisol on and off quite a bit, and I can tell you she has a lot of experience in the area of forages, and she's very well-rounded. She's a go-getter, and she has great proposals, grant projects, research work, so I can attest to her being a fun person to work with and a great person for any forage question. She has a lot of practical skill. As far as her professional bio, she has interest in forage, cover crop, bioenergy crops, production research, sustainability, resilience, and environmental impact of cropping systems. And this really shows through in a lot of the research work that Dr. Berti does. Right now, she's researching work on alfalfa, corn, intercropping. We have done a little bit of that together across state lines. She's also looking at sunflower, alfalfa intercropping, forage sorghum, and winter camelina as a cover crop and potential low carbon intensity biofuel crop. So she really has interest in a lot of areas in the forage world and has her fingers in soil health and all of those. She's really a joy to work with. She's a fun person, and I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Berti.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's great to be here. A little closer. Can you hear me now? Is that okay? All right. I haven't been in Sioux Falls other than been through I-29 or the other one. So it's great to be here. I just want to start with a little bit about myself. Following the last two great speakers is going to be kind of hard, but they're wonderful. But I'm going to try to line up what I'm going to talk about with what they're saying because everything is interrelated. So you hear a little bit of an accent. Sorry, I can't get rid of it. I'm originally from Chile, from South America. I've been here for a long time, but you don't get rid of the accent very quickly. So I came in the early 90s. I'm not going to tell you the exact day, so you don't calculate my age. But in the early 90s, I came here, worked to a seed company to do an internship. I studied agronomy in Chile. Just many of you that study agronomy. I studied agronomy because I really like nature. Everyone in my family wanted me to study medicine, but I like plants. So I sneak up and register for agronomy. They didn't like that. And the other thing is I grew up in Santiago, which is a really large city, 7 million people. And I want to make sure when I finish college, I wasn't going to live in Santiago ever again. And it worked. I never did. I never did come back to live to Santiago. Then I came here. I met my husband. He's American, from northern Iowa, Norwegian. And so you're familiar with that, right? And so my children are all Americans, so the only Chilean in the family now. But I really enjoy my life here. I did both of my degrees at NDSU, so very familiar with the area. I've switched areas. I worked in Chile for a while, too, at the university. But I've always worked with crops. The forage crops were a kind of new thing. When the position opened at NDSU, I was working on crops, cropping systems, oilseeds. And then this position came. They called me and said, you should apply. I said, forages, what is that? And so I didn't know anything about it. So I didn't grow up with forages. I'm not a farmer either. And so they called me for the interview. And then the professor that was retiring, he asked me, he said, I'm going to take you a field and show you this. And then he goes, you know what is this? And I go, grass? And he goes, uh-oh, this is a problem. I never heard of forages, but I've enjoyed so much to learn and be able to see how these wonderful plants bring so many things to our lives, to our soils. I don't think people realize the importance. A lot of people, when I tell them, they ask me, what do you do? I say, I work on forages. And they go, 4-H? No, I say, forages, they're plants. I have to explain. Most people don't even understand that a lot of what we eat, a lot of what we do has to do with forages. I always tell people, and I said, if it wasn't for forages, you wouldn't have ice cream. So always remember that. So what I want to talk today a little bit is about the research that we've been doing for a while. I've been doing research at NDSU on cover crops and forages, a little more in forages, and all these crazy ideas that we came up with. As you know, in the Northern Plains, we have a very short season to do and integrate other crops, right? We want to increase diversity because increasing diversity of plants increases diversity in our soils. So we've been doing kind of work, even the topic says interseeding corn. I'm working with many other crops, and I want to show you a little bit these and tie up a little bit to the two speakers, what they were talking about. So a little bit of definition. Sorry, I'm a teacher, so I have to teach first. So I teach the principles of forage production class for my students at NDSU. So intercropping. Okay, there depends the field you are, intercropping can mean different things, right? So, but in here it means really growing 2 or more crops on the same piece of land unit, okay? They can be 2 grain crops. In some countries they grow corn and soybean together. It can be, and even in the Northern Great Plains, there's people trying with something like pea and canola. They call it piola, okay? There's several things like that. We can do grain and forage crops, and that's what I'm doing a lot. You can do 2 forage crops, or many of them. Although when we do a mix of cover crops and stuff, we don't call it intercropping, but technically is intercropping too. And then you've heard a lot about the interseeded cover crops, which would be like a partial type of intercropping. Now, there are many different arrangements of intercropping that you can do. You can have row intercropping. That will mean 1 row crop, the next row of another crop, alternating rows. You can have mix. That means I put all the seeds together and throw them like a cover crop mix. You can have a relay intercropping. How many of you have heard of relay here? Oh, you guys are good. I don't have to say then. But relay is when I start a crop, and then later I start the second one, or I plant the second one before I harvest the first one. And then I harvest first one, the other one keeps going. So it's like a relay race, right? I put 2 in it. And there are different ways that people define the relay cropping, and we've been doing quite a bit of things. With that, I won't talk too much about it today, but the thing is we have to be very creative to be able to get more than 1 crop in our season, right? Because we don't have the luxury of being able to do double cropping like in southern states. It just doesn't fit in our environment. And then the interseeding is more referred when I put a cover crop or a plant at a V2 stage, V2 to R4, any way in between, either in corn or in soybean or a different crop. So that's interseeding, right? So I've been working with a lot of the things, and I'll show you a little bit of what we've done and what things are working now, and why are we doing this, right? The main reason to do these things is we increase the yield per unit of land when we do this. That means if you sum both crops, they produce more than each crop alone, okay? So that's called something land equivalent ratio. That means you're producing more per unit of land. It's a more efficient use of resources, reduces soil erosion. Dr. Nichols showed all the horrible pictures. I got a lot of pictures of snort too, unfortunately. When you're doing any of these, you're using more of the season because you have 2 crops. You're covering for longer, right? You enhance soil health because you get diversity. You get more than 1 plant in one place. Reduces greenhouse gases emissions. We've talked about climate change and all that. Well, when you do this, you are reducing that, and I'll explain a little bit why. And increased biodiversity above ground and below ground. And we always forget, many times when people say biodiversity, we think of butterflies and bees. Maybe I do, but the most important biodiversity is the one in the soil, right? We really increase that one, which is nature working. We've got a lot of different grants working. 10 years ago, I've been 13 years at NDSU. When I started presenting grants, they thought I was crazy. They still think I'm crazy, but it's okay. And one reviewer told me, because we call one grant novel cropping system, he said, what is novel about that? And I said, you're right. Nature's been doing this long time before we did. Our ancestors did this, right? Intercropping Our ancestors didn't do monocultures. Nobody did. So it's true. The reviewer was right. It's not an overcropping system, but it was a nice catchy title. Finally, I did get it funded and got $3.7 million to do that, which is great, right? And there is a strip intercropping. That's kind of intercropping where instead of putting one row and the other one, I use the width of my planter with one crop and the other width pass of the planter with a different crop, which they have different functionalities in the environment and how things work, but they all really aim to increase diversity and productivity in the same land. But one thing that's happened in my project when I started, we always want to study yield. Everything was about production. I'm a production researcher, so we're always measuring yield, measuring, quality and forage quality. But in the last few years, we switched. We're not so interested in yield and quality. I'm interested in the benefits of these systems to the ecosystem, to the environment. So we move all my graduate students now. I have them counting insects, bees, doing soil microbiome. So we want to know what is the impact to everything else, because really that's what is important. The problem is we focus on yield, and I really like what Dr. Nichols says. Yield is that word that she doesn't like. And that's driven everything, but we've missed in. We actually have reduced all these ecosystem services that the crops and the plants produce because we've been focusing on yield. And there are things you can do. People say, yeah, but I can make money doing that, what you said. There's things you can do, right? So I'm not going to talk too much about interseeding, and the reason is I work at least 10 years on interseeding with my graduate students. We got tons of publications that are cut off there, but if you want them, on interseeding with all kinds of different crops, interseeding rye, fava bean, clovers, everything you can think of, and different dates, and corn, and soybean, different methods. We got a lot of publications on that. Nutrient cycling to see if we get some nitrogen from these cover crops. And the results, we got some results and some things that work, but in general, in North Dakota, so in the northern part, interseeding cover crops really doesn't work, okay? So we wanted to switch a little bit. But anyway, the results did show that it's better drill than broadcast. You guys know that. It's obviously that it's better drilling than broadcast, if you can drill. Rye work better than everything else. We tried everything, and rye always work better. It's more shade tolerant than other ones. One thing that is very obvious too is anything in successful establishment, success of cover crops has to do with dependent on rainfall. And especially if you're broadcasting. You depend on rainfall. Doesn't rain, you don't get a cover crop. Don't get a cover crop, no roots, no diversity, no nothing. So it's very important, right? And soybean, anything before leaf drop didn't work with any crop because we measure light inside. There's no light under the canopy. If you could lay down under the canopy of a soybean, it's dark there. It's night. We got 98% of light interception in the canopy. Right? It's darker than in corn. Because corn, because of the leaves, lets some light through, but soybean doesn't. So in corn, you can plant a little early, and some crops will survive if you get rain. But in soybean, you plant earlier, like a V6, nothing will survive. No light, okay? So in corn, V6 actually worked better than R6, and I'll show you some pictures why. It worked better earlier than later, like in soybean. And in summary, I would say it's very difficult to establish a crop. I know many of you have probably done it. Sometimes works, but most of the time doesn't work, and especially in North Dakota. Why? Because we have a very short growing season, so we really don't have room between these. And the spring is super wet, and the fall is super dry. So like last fall, 2022, it stopped raining on the last week of August, and I haven't seen rain after that. It never rained again. Every cover crop we plant, nothing came. Nothing. We're hoping the seed is there. Maybe we'll get something in the spring, but that's what we get. And other falls, it gets so wet, nobody can harvest. You guys are harvesting in January, right, when it's frozen. We never know. And it's weird, the spring's the same. Last spring was so wet that we were so late. We were so late planting, we're planting wheat in June. So of course, when we were to plant cover crops after wheat, we were planting in September, which was too late anyway. So always we depend on that. And then sometimes, of course, in North Dakota, we get some very early fall frost. You know, we get easily a frost in September 10. And that's all the warm season, and even the other ones die too. And so one thing that we kind of say, okay, we work a lot on this. We got a lot of publication, about 12 students graduate from this. But really, I don't have extension appointment. My colleague, Abby Wick, that I'm sure a lot of you know, she does a great job with extension, is we really need people to start thinking to include cereals or wheat on your rotation. The only way to get a good growth of a cover crop is having wheat, so you have time to do it. Trying to feed a cover crop in a corn, soybean rotation only, it is very hard. It's very hard. And the other thing we've done is what we're working now, which is intercropping with forages, right? But before I do that, I want to show, when I notice, when I take pictures of my plots of my students, I always take pictures of things that work for some reason, right? I don't take the empty plots, right? And so peas look really good there, but if you look at the data, they really didn't work. That was right, interseeded into soybean. We harvested soybean, it looks really nice, right? We wish we had that. And even we have some grower fields in some years really work really nice. That field was interseeded with an interseeded planter that we had. It was 100 acres. We interseeded at V8 of the corn, radish and rye. They're both there. Really nice. We were able to do that once. One fall it worked. Never worked again. So it's a beautiful picture. But what we see more often is this. This field was aerially broadcasted with rye. And you see a few plants here and there, almost nothing. And the thing with rye, with corn, the residue, if you broadcast late and you already have leaves that are broken and dead, there what happens is they can't reach the ground and you'll get enough rain, you won't get a crop. And that mix actually had crimson clover, rye, and radish. And rye is the only thing we see there, one plant. This other field was soybean. And they also was flown a mix of cover crops. And then after harvest, there's a plant here and there. But in generally, when you try to scale up this in North Dakota, there are more failures than successes, unfortunately. Okay? I don't want to discourage anyone from trying it, because sometimes it does work, but we have to try other things. And that's why we start working a lot with intercropping, which for me is the best part of both worlds, because then I get to do the forage part, right? And so I like the forage part. So we start working with the alfalfa corn intercropping in 2014. This wasn't my idea. This is an idea that started working in Wisconsin. In a way, in Wisconsin, Dr. Graver started working on this system, trying to get more farmers to plant alfalfa on a corn silage alfalfa system. They have a lot of dairies there, but because corn silage produces so much more than alfalfa, a lot of farmers are going to monoculture corn silage, which is a very, very extractive crop. Takes pretty much everything from the ground because you take the whole biomass out of the ground, no residue. You take, you know, we're talking about carbon fixed from the atmosphere. Because some people say, oh, we fix a lot of carbon. Yeah, right. But you took it all out of the field, and when you fed the cows, what happened with the carbon on the corn? Where does it go back? To the air. The cells of the cow respire. CO2 is right back in the air where it came from. So you didn't gain any sequestration by doing that. So that system had a problem, and he thought this would be a way to improve that. And interesting, I said, that sounds like a good idea, something we could do in North Dakota, but since we don't have much dairy, let's do it with grain corn. Mm-hmm. And actually, it worked much better than in Wisconsin because our corn plants were a lot shorter. So they let a lot more light for the alfalfa. So they have problems. They actually have to apply a growth regulator and some fungicides to get the alfalfa to survive under the shade of the corn. We didn't have to. We actually tried that growth regulator. We don't have to use it. We don't have to use it. We've done different studies in many different locations. And And we've been able to get this system to work. Now, it has, some trade-offs that you have to want to do this. First, you have to want to have alfalfa in your field, okay? This is not a cover crop that I'm going to kill next year. I'm establishing alfalfa using a corn as a companion crop, right? That's what I'm doing. Now, alfalfa uses a lot of water. So, of course, we're going to take a yield loss on that corn. We know that. What is the gain then? So if you look at this little graph I have there, the gain here is that first, you do, the alfalfa does behave as a cover crop, so all those losses of nitrates and phosphate at the end of the season will be protected because alfalfa will take them up, okay? And then the next year, you have a first-year alfalfa that is going to be fully productive. For those, how many of you grow alfalfa here? There's a few, yeah. The first year or seeding year of alfalfa, you only get maybe 2 cuts, and you'll get 2.5 tons per acre. That's it, right? When you do this, your first year alfalfa is going to be double the yield because it's already established. So it's going to behave as established alfalfa. So instead of 2.5, you're going to get 5 tons per acre. So that's and the idea is that you keep your alfalfa for maybe another year, at least another year to get in the rotation. One of my goals here, and of many other ones that work on this project, is how we get more farmers to incorporate alfalfa back in the rotation. Alfalfa used to be an important component of rotations back 30, 40 years ago. When we didn't have all these nitrogen fertilizers, chemical, they were cheap, people needed alfalfa to be able to have that nitrogen. So it was very important, but with the commodity prices and making things easy, getting all the fences out and just grow corn and soybean, we lost that component. And we lost not only alfalfa, we lost a lot of the ecosystem services offered by alfalfa. And so that's what happened. And so I'll show you a little bit of the results that we're doing in this, and I'll show you some other things too. So as expected, and this is some of the results that we have. We have here, I have two values for, one is with the 7 locations average altogether, and the other one is with the 3 locations. So this curve, this like orange color bars, they're the 3 driest locations that we have, okay? Because obviously this system's gonna have to do that. So this is the corn alone, this is grain yield. Okay, and these are the ones with intercropping, one with a growth regulator that we don't use anymore, but we did that at the beginning because we thought we needed. You can see that there is a yield loss. We know that, right? Now, in the drier years, at least the interesting here, you can see a big drag. So the drag went from 20 to 42 bushels per acre. Everyone says, no, I can't lose that. That's a lot of money, right? Especially now with the higher prices. But the point of this is, okay, you are getting a lot of benefits. We're not harvesting the alfalfa. We plant the alfalfa and the corn at the same time. We're not harvesting the alfalfa the first year. It's just going to be in between the corn. And what's going to happen here, too, is next year, so this picture is next year, the alfalfa yield now, okay? And we were comparing this with an alfalfa that would be spring seeded. If we spring, let's say we have corn this year, next year we do the spring seed alfalfa, that will be the business as usual, right? I don't need to do intercropping, I plant it next year. So that alfalfa is going to produce, about half of the yield of those that came from intercropping. That's in the same year. Because this is 2 cuts, these ones have, they have 4 cuts, okay? And this was alfalfa alone, which we know that intercropping is not going to be exactly the same as alfalfa planted last year alone. Alfalfa that was planted last year alone is going to be better on the first year. But what is interesting about here is the green bars now, which are the year 3, there was no differences. So they're all even out. So in the 3rd year, you couldn't tell, and on all our experiments, we did some on farm too, you couldn't tell which one came from intercropping, which ones came from alfalfa planted alone, whether the first year or the 2nd year. There wasn't difference in yield, there wasn't difference in plant density, anything. Okay, so the system works in of course, you have to, take that loss. But it depends, how you look at that, right? 2.5 tons extra of forage on the year, with the prices of forage now, is more than what you lose with the corn, okay? But you have to think a longer term. And I think that's something we have to start doing, right? Don't think just on the economics of 1 year, but trying to think a little longer than that, okay? Now, it was really interesting. I had a field day, I was showing these in North Dakota, and some of the farmers came up with a great idea. Farmers, you guys always have the greatest ideas. Excuse me. There is a group of farmers in the Red River Valley near Fargo and Castleton, which they don't have, almost none of them has cattle. It's only corn, soybean, wheat area. And one of them said, we're going to get a group together of like 12 farmers, and we're going to do your system in the headlands. Because the corn in those headlands doesn't produce much anyway, right? Because we got wet area, salinity, whatever. So he's saying we got one of the 12 that he does have cattle. He offered to cut and hay all the headlands in the year after. So they're doing it. They're starting to do that. And then, so 12 of them got together to get that system going, which is really interesting because it's something I would never thought, and I think they got close to 500 acres together to start doing this, okay? And so they're creating ways to try to incorporate systems, because I know the first thing a lot of them say, the grain growers, they say, well, I don't have alfalfa, I don't have animals, I can't sell it, I don't have the equipment. But there's ways to start integrating these crops that are beneficial. And what I'm going to show you after this is the benefits that alfalfa has to the environment. We've been doing a lot of work with modeling soil carbon sequestration. You hear a lot about that, the carbon credits, nitrous oxide emissions. So there's a lot of things that they're happening when you do these systems that we never thought about, but now they're coming up to light. This is another variation that we did, in case you're interested. I had another student that instead of doing just the 30-inch rows on corn with alfalfa, we also did we skip a row. They call it skip row or, wide row. I don't know, the different names. So 60-inch row corn instead of 30-inch corn, okay? We didn't see much differences within the same, and these years that we did this, all this data is also always 4 environments average, okay? It's not just one location. But there wasn't much significant difference in these. So I'm looking at the yellow bars are the corn yield, okay? Not much difference within the same row spacing, so 76 centimeters, 30-inch. And within the 152, if you look at that one and that one have the same letter, they're not significantly different. But there is a huge difference between 30 and 60. So the point here is, because some people are doing this with cover crops too, by doing a wide row, you are losing yield in the corn, whether you put alfalfa or cover crops or not, right? Because you're not using all the light. And we didn't change the population. We still had all these corn plants, so they were really close together in the row. So there's kind of competition there. But then the green bars is the alfalfa yield, and again, we got the same response. And we've got this, every time we've done this, we get double the yield compared to the spring planting of the same year. So very interesting results, and if anyone's interested in more, we got a lot of information coming up, and we keep working on this system. The difference that now we're doing with this is and I'll start with this part, instead of focusing on yield or economics, we're focusing on the environmental impacts and the benefits to the environment, okay? So all the trials, we keep repeating these trials, but now instead of just doing yield, we're doing a lot more things. And this is the results of a study one of my postdocs did in trying to evaluate different cropping systems that included this alfalfa intercropping, okay? In the soil carbon balance, nitrous oxide, nitrate leaching, and global warming, and I'll explain each one of them. So we modeled and compared, with data we had, the corn, soybean, corn rotation, alfalfa the 3 years, so this is seeding year plus 2 years alfalfa, corn alone, and then next year, seeding year of alfalfa and alfalfa, and then our corn alfalfa intercropping. So now this alfalfa is like a whole production alfalfa, and then another year of alfalfa. So those systems were compared, and there's certain parameters when you do modeling that you use. So we consider that all the residue of all the corn and soybean was staying on the soil, so kind of mimicking a no-till system. And then these are the fertilization, because it's very important to always report these, because the fertilization rates have a huge impact on especially nitrous oxide and nitrate leaching. Okay. So the soil carbon balance, and this is the sum of in and out. So carbon that comes in the system, carbon that come out the system as CO2 in all these different systems, right? And this is a balance sum of the 3 years of the rotation of the system. So you can see that, and so when you have corn, the residue stays there, that's an input, a positive input, and the grain that you take out, that's out, right? It was fixed on the atmosphere, but it left the field. And the same with alfalfa alone. Alfalfa, when you produce alfalfa, you cut the whole thing. So it's true, alfalfa fixes a lot of carbon, but you take it out of the field. Okay, so what is left is what is in the roots. Now, alfalfa has much deeper and more roots, because it's a perennial, than corn. So the two systems here, the corn, soybean, corn had the lowest soil carbon balance, while the two systems, even the one where you put corn and 2 years alfalfa, had much greater, and the intercropping one was a little bit greater than that. And the nitrous oxide emission was a lot more impactful, results. We can expect that, we know that. Because in this rotation, we had 2 years of corn, and we're putting 124 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen fertilizer, right? And that has a huge impact. Like Dr. Nichols said very well, the nitrogen you put in a fertilizer, about 50% is lost. It doesn't go in the plant, or even more. 60% of the nitrogen that you put in fertilizer does not go in the plant. So it's got to go somewhere. Where does it go? Either in the water as nitrate or as nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide might not be super high, but the thing is that nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas, which is 288 times more powerful than a molecule of CO2. So it has more ability of retain heat in the atmosphere. And so when they calculate, and you heard the global warming potential, they calculated on a unit called CO2 equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent, is because they're considering all the greenhouse gases, not just CO2. So even if we lose a little bit of that nitrogen as nitrous oxide, the impact on the greenhouse gases and the global warming are very high, okay? So definitely this is because of the nitrogen fertilization is the one with the highest nitrous oxide emissions. Alfalfa alone, or these systems, were the lowest. So when alfalfa is a legume, we don't need to put nitrogen on the system, right? Because it produces its own. So it doesn't produce, or produce very little, nitrous oxide emissions. Nitrate leaching, same result. We're putting a lot of nitrogen, a lot goes in the water. Compared with the other 3 rotations, the alfalfa alone, almost no losses to nitrate. Alfalfa is a very good scavenger. People forget, and we think of radishes and everything. Alfalfa is a great scavenger of nitrogen in the soil. Alfalfa, I always say, my favorite plant, is a very smart plant. It's true, fixes nitrogen. But fixing nitrogen with the rhizobium is a very expensive physiological mechanism for the plant. The nitrogen molecule is N2. It has a triple bond, which is really, really hard to break. So the plant needs to do, and Dr. Nichols said, 32 ATP, you need to break that N2. So for that, the plant has to give the rhizobium a lot of carbohydrates and energy and phosphorus to be able to do that. So if you're putting a lot of fertilizer and nitrate there, why bother, right? The plant is smart. The plant the plant won't give carbohydrates to the rhizobia if there's nitrogen there, because taking nitrogen from the soil, so the plants of alfalfa are going to deplete all the nitrogen is in the soil before they do symbiosis with the rhizobia and tell, okay, I need you now. I'll give you carbohydrates. I need the nitrogen, right? Before not. So all these symbiosis Dr. Nichols was talking are very important, because this is a talking. There is a paper that I think is fantastic. It's called, do you speak plantish, fungish, or bactish? So which language are you communicating with? If the alfalfa plant, you're putting a lot for phosphorus fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, doesn't need these organisms. So in a way, you're inhibiting the bacteria, you're inhibiting the arbuscular mycorrhiza, because the plant doesn't need it. Why should it share any carbohydrates with these organisms if they cannot give it anything because the plant has it? So with our agriculture of high input, we actually inhibit these very important associations. And we know, you've seen this, right? Alfalfa roots are so much deeper. So alfalfa, the longer it stays on the rotation, you're going to start fixing a lot of carbon and keeping that carbon in the soil, okay? Very deep in the soil compared to corn and soybean. And so it's very important to consider this, because when we talk, we might produce a lot in corn in the upper part, so corn silage, we produce a lot of tons, right, a lot of carbon, but we take it out of the field. We don't leave it in the field. While in alfalfa roots, even we are harvesting all the tops, we are leaving all this in there, okay? So that's why it has a lot of impact, and actually we thought this corn alfalfa system actually had more impact than we thought. And actually we start, when you have alfalfa in the rotation, whether you do intercropping or not, you start storing carbon, right? You start storing carbon. In a really slow climate change, you produce less nitrous oxide emissions. You also protect the water, but you start really transferring. Alfalfa, that's not my data, but alfalfa can transfer up to 1,400 pounds of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in a year. So it's a really good, takes out all the carbon from the soil, put it in the roots, right? And roots of alfalfa are very lignified. They're not going to decay very fast, especially the tap roots. The smaller roots might. So it is a very way to sequester carbon. And I like to hear more people when they're talking about sequestering carbon in the soil, the use of alfalfa. I don't hear enough to my liking. I hear a lot about cover crops and grasses, but alfalfa is a great way to put carbon in the soil. And so when we calculated total global warming potential, this includes, and this is calculated through a system called life cycle assessment. This considers all the carbon inputs on a system. A lot of people say, we increase the yields, we produce all this yield in corn. Yes, but you put in a lot of input of nitrogen fertilizer. How many of you know how you produce urea? How you produce urea? Where does the nitrogen and the urea comes from? Where does it come from? Air. How does it get into the urea molecule? You've heard of a process called Haber-Bosch, right? It's an industrial process that uses natural gas. It needs a lot of energy. So it's a fossil fuel. So the urea alone that you're putting, every molecule of nitrogen you put in there already has a really high carbon footprint, because you had to burn a lot of fossil fuel to produce it. So even before you're putting that in there, you're putting all those. So this considers all the inputs, the carbon, the fossil fuel footprint. They have pesticides, seed, everything, okay, that goes into. And then we have everything that is sequestered too. So it's very important to consider everything, because I can't produce all the yields I produce and all the carbon that corn fixes, it wouldn't be able to do it if you didn't fertilize it like that. It would produce a lot less. So the carbon fix there is already, and in many cases when they've done LCA corn, you come even. You're putting so much inputs, they're carbon rich, that whatever you're fixing and using, it just comes even, right? So when you put alfalfa in here, this is the global warming potential and CO2 equivalent, which includes the nitrous oxide, which is the other thing you saw, the corn, soybean, corn rotation has so much nitrous oxide losses that it adds to the total global warming potential. And you can see that these two have a positive value, so that means they cause global warming, while the two ones, they have corn, but they have alfalfa in 2 years, and this was in the intercropping. They have now negative global warming. That means they sequester carbon. Okay. Now this is done with modeling. It's not. It is really hard to measure all these gases in and out. There's a lot of people working on that, but this is more or less what's happening, right? So by incorporating this, you have so many good potential things that they can happen in the soil, and that's because of all these microbiome that you have in the soil that is allowing, to fix this carbon when you're doing that. One thing I want to show, and this is a new project that we got funded just recently, and I have Chris Graham, and he's part of this project. So we're going to start doing this another crazy idea. So we're happy that NIFA decided that was a good project. I think if I was to present this 10 years ago, they would say you are absolutely crazy, but they like it. So we're start doing it already with sunflower alfalfa. And the reason for this is because both North Dakota and South Dakota are the main producers of sunflower, right? And in the same counties where most of the sunflowers produce, they're also the counties with the most alfalfa. So this is something that could work. We know it's a little maybe more difficult than with corn, but again, has other benefits. Also, we're evaluating weed suppression and other things. So the results on this one, significantly, we really didn't see a reduction in yield in alfalfa, in sunflower. But, I know it's a trend too, and we expected that. And here we also did the 30-inch and the 60-inch, okay? 30-inch sunflower or 60-inch sunflower with and without alfalfa. And the 60-inch with alfalfa is definitely lower. One thing I've got a lot of questions about this, and my students measure, is the soil moisture. We know now we got two crops that are really high users of water, right? And you can show, and you can see it here. You can see the sunflower alone, the alfalfa alone, and you can see this is the beginning of the season, and all the systems use water, right? But at the end of the season, you can see, the purple one, which is the 60-inch here. And the alfalfa alone has actually the lowest, but the combined system have higher. But they all reduce water, right? Because when we did this, was a dry year. So it has a complexity, but we've seen this system go through, and the alfalfa survived very well under both systems. And so my students this year, they did the yield. Again, these low bars are where it was planted this year. 2022, not this year. I guess it's last year. Last year already. So this is the spring seed alfalfa versus the one coming from intercropping. These two at 30 and 6 inches, and the alfalfa alone. And you see, again, the same thing with corn, right? The seeded alfalfa in the same year is half or less than half than the yield. Sarah's in 5 minutes, so almost done. And then one thing that happens, we're worried about the interception of light because sunflowers' broad leaves will let less light come in, but alfalfa actually did very good. We didn't have a problem. So it's a potential system. We still got a lot of things to work with it. Very new system. We're just a year on that. We've got a lot of good funding, so now I'm not so crazy anymore, so I'll be able to get money. So we got some really big grants to do this work, which supports a lot of students, which I couldn't do without any of them. And we've been doing a lot of biodiversity. I showed on my other talk about all the things that we're doing with, I'm working with microbiologists, they're doing the mycorrhiza. So in all these systems, they've been measuring mycorrhiza, they've been measuring the rhizobia. And one thing that's really neat is that in the corn intercropping with alfalfa, the alfalfa had the most nodules compared to the alfalfa alone. When it was with corn, it had over double the number of nodules, rhizobia, than when it was alone. And also the mycorrhiza, Dr. Heike Buking, that she's in Missouri now, The arbuscular mycorrhiza fungi were also, the arbuscles, the colonization was much greater in both the corn and the alfalfa when they were together than they were alone. Why is that? It's because these plants are meant to grow together, and when they're together, they know they need each other. So alfalfa increases, and there's some research that's doing that. They've been able to demonstrate that alfalfa increases in about 20 to 30% the nitrogen fixation rate when you plant it with corn. Because it needs to feed the other one, but it doesn't feed it directly. It feeds it through the hyphae of the mycorrhizae. So just putting two plants together, you increase the biodiversity of the soil by a lot more. So with that, without my students, postdocs, and everyone that works, I couldn't do any of this because they do all the hard work. But it's really fun to work on this, and thank you. Thanks for listening to me. I got time? Yes.
So we can take a couple questions. We have a couple minutes here.
So the guys or the group of farmers that went together and did it on the headlands, I'm assuming that taking 200 bushel corn off, they also had compaction problems on their headlands. Then when did they get a good stand of alfalfa there, and were they still running the grain carts and stuff across those headlands, or did they move them across the alfalfa, or did they move them out further into the field?
That's a really hard question because I don't know the details. They just started last year, so it's a very new thing they're doing. But, excuse me, their idea is those headlands are still having problems with compaction, salinity. I don't know they're still doing that, but whatever alfalfa they can get there from the neighbor, is something that they wouldn't have anyway. And so I don't know, and I'll ask them this year how they do with the alfalfa, how productive it is, and how the whole system works, and maybe I can answer those questions next year, but I don't really know now. And but I thought it was a really great idea from them to adapt a system, to their grain production because they're mainly corn, soybean growers. Since we can't really put cover crops in between the system, this will be at least, if you have the headlands, you're still protecting your water because alfalfa will trap all those nitrates and phosphorus that are being lost from the field. So it's still a benefit. But we hope to know more on those larger acres. So far, it's just our plot research is showing this, but we are hopeful that more people will try to adopt some version of this system. Thank you.
Are you planting it at the same time or one before the other?
We plant the corn and the alfalfa at the same time, and then sunflower too. So what we do is we just run the corn planter, and we've done this in larger on-farm research. We run the corn planter, and then we run the alfalfa drill right on top, same day. So it's the same. And the corn alfalfa, we use Roundup Ready alfalfa, so we can use glyphosate for weed control. And the sunflower system we use in Clearfield sunflower, which alfalfa is, the label herbicides are pursuit and raptor, so they're within that same group of herbicides. So in both systems you can make it work with the wheat. Now, you wouldn't be able to use some of the residuals that you use, but another thing we're finding, and I didn't have the results here, is alfalfa suppresses weed in the row. When you have corn alone, you always get some water hems that survive there. They're stringy, but they're there and produce seed. When you had alfalfa, there's no weeds in there. So it helps. So you might be able to get through with just the glyphosate application.
Do you use any sort of pre-merge herbicide?
No pre-merge. You almost don't have to, but we'll have to probably evaluate more, but it's shown that when you have the alfalfa there, you really don't need the pre-emergent because the alfalfa will take care of that, in between the rows of corn. Okay, thank you. I don't know if I don't have more time.
If there are more questions, we're out of time for more questions, but if you have more, please feel free to catch Dr. Berti. I'm not sure how long she'll be here. She'll be here until tomorrow morning. Yeah. So she's a wealth of knowledge if you have forage questions. Just a second, don't leave me. So we want to thank you so much for coming down. I know it's a long trip, and I think a couple things that I pulled from your talk that were really interesting. Right at the end, you were hitting on the cues of, just having just those two plants together. Mm-hmm. And we talk sometimes about having 10-way mixtures when we talk cover crops. But just 2 cash crops together can make that much of a difference, and that's a research difference. We have some of that work going on here in South Dakota. So if I sampled your alfalfa 2 years ago, you're a part of that work. So lots of fun things happening. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank
we
you.
have a gift for you.
Oh, thanks so
and
much.
appreciate all of your efforts.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Sarah.